Our next question comes in as anonymous out of Richmond Hill, Georgia, and they write, "Hello, Dr. Broggi. Will you please tell us what you know and have learned about the 1599 Geneva Bible, as it keeps coming up with people I know? And I wanted to get your take on it based on the research that you have done. Thank you."
Well, it's interesting because a number of years ago, and I actually have a copy, someone gave it to me, and I'm grateful they did, the 1599 Geneva Bible with the updated English language and the updated notes. And so the Geneva Bible came with a set of notes. It's what we might call a study Bible today. Now, there was other study Bibles that came into America, like the Schofield Study Bible, and the notes were useful. So the notes are obviously not inspired, but they reflect a theological persuasion. And probably you're hearing a lot about the Geneva Bible for the simple reason that there's a new movement called the Neo-Calvinistic movement, the New Calvinists. And it's represented by guys like R.C. Sproul and John Piper. And they're wrong. They have a distorted view of how God saves people in terms of the atonement of Christ. Look, even John Calvin was not a 5-point Calvinist. He was a 4-point Calvinist. John Calvin did not believe that Christ died only for the elect. He believed the atonement was unlimited. So it's not until 1580 Besa affirms, the atonement is limited. Listen, the atonement, the death of Christ was for all men. I believe I can look in anyone in the eye and say that Christ died for you. So when you come to the Geneva Bible and you read their notes, you discover that the 1599 Geneva Bible, while it's a good translation in the sense of affirming good sound translation techniques, and so even a dispensationalist would affirm, no, it's a decent translation. It's built off of the Tyndale Bible. And I cover this in my course on bibliology, how we got the English Bible. And the King James heavily relied upon it, not the notes, but they relied upon the translation because why? You want to compare. Well, how did they understand this Greek word? How did they understand this Hebrew word? And to make sure that they're in sync with hundreds of other translators maybe who had been involved in the translation process before them. But I don't like the Geneva Bible notes. I like some of them because, again, they would affirm certain non-negotiable doctrines like the doctrine of the Trinity and the substitutionary atonement and all the like. But on the other hand, they're Calvinistic in their eschatology. So there's no future for Israel. Oh, they do. I've read the notes in Romans 11. Kind of like Charles Hodge in his systematic theology, he affirms that there's going to be some Jews in the future who are going to have a dramatic turning. I mean, you just really have to write off a lot, but he doesn't see any distinction for national Israel. And so your Calvinistic teacher today, like an R.C. or a Piper, would affirm that there's no significance at all for Israel being back in the land. None whatsoever. Boy, R.C. knows better now. No, God's plan for Israel was unconditional in nature. God is going to keep his promises to Israel, and he's going to use that nation as his tool to bring the nations of the world to faith in a dramatic way like we've never seen, and ultimately to bring his son back from heaven. No, this is what is prophesied. And so what do? They spiritualize the prophecies concerning the second coming of Christ. So take the book of Zechariah, for instance. There's a number of prophecies that specifically point to the literal return of literal first coming of Jesus to the earth. So, for instance, the Messiah, when he comes, he is going to be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. The Geneva Bible will recognize that he was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver via the fulfillment through Judas. The Geneva Bible will recognize the prophecy that Zechariah writes of, that the shepherd will be struck and the sheep will scatter. And the New Testament quotes that. I mean, how could they not recognize it? And they'll affirm that, yes, that was literally fulfilled at Christ's first coming. The Geneva Bible will recognize, Messiah coming into Jerusalem on a donkey, Zechariah 9. They would say, yes, that was literally fulfilled. How could they deny it? It's covered in the Gospels as being fulfilled in Jesus. The Geneva Bible will recognize, they'll look on me whom they have pierced, which John quotes in the initial looking in John 19, where they see Jesus hanging on the cross, and he said this was a fulfillment, and he quotes Zechariah. How are those prophecies for the first coming fulfilled? Literally. Okay, let's go to the second coming. For instance, in Zechariah 14, I could hit on 8 and 12, but let's just deal with 14 for the sake of time. Zechariah 14, Messiah is going to plant his feet on the Mount of Olives and split it in two. Is that literally going to be fulfilled? In Zechariah 12, he's going to say that all the nations of the world are going to oppose Israel. Has there ever been a time in human history where all the nations of the world have opposed Israel? Never, ever, ever. But it's going to happen. We're at the end of time prior to the second advent of the Messiah. So how do they interpret the splitting of the Mount of Olives? They spiritualize it. And so you can read 10 amillennialists and get 10 interpretations on what it means that the Mount of Olives is going to be split in two. Maybe the most popular is it's your heart being broken and converted. It's not talking about that. You have no right to do that. So I don't like the notes in the Geneva Bible, except for instructional purposes, to know what they're teaching that was in error. About why is it so popular? Because the neo-Calvinistic movement is very popular and it's gaining strength. And by their lack of teaching of what God says in Israel, they're feeding the anti-Semitic spirit. Anti-Semitism is not going to lessen, it's going to grow, and it's going to come to a peak after the church is removed at the rapture. The greatest expression, but we're seeing it building. And so you have all these Reformed Baptist, Reformed Presbyterian churches who have said nothing about October 7th. They've said nothing about what has happened in Israel, and their lack of teaching about God's unconditional covenant for the people of Israel is feeding anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that Piper and R.C. Sproul were anti-Semites like Calvin and Luther and Augustine were. And those guys said disgusting statements about the Jewish people. But by their failure to teach what God does say about Israel, it feeds the spirit of anti-Semitism. And that's why I don't like the Geneva Bible in terms of not the translation. The translation's fine. In terms of its notes, because they have a twisted view of Israel. Good question. Let's go to the next.
Dr. Carl Broggi answers your questions about the Bible and living the Christian life Tuesday mornings at 11 on The Light 88.7 FM and online around the world at wagp.net.